And here we go, folks. Welcome to today's program. My name is Gary Sarkissian, and I am the Director of Education and Content at CFA Society Boston. In today's program, we will be focusing on political strategy and moving away from market strategy. As we all know, the midterm elections this year could easily alter the balance of power in Washington, D.C., and of course, the outlook for financial markets. With the election uncertainty in mind, 2022 is becoming quite a choppy year for investors. For the most part, all eyes have been on the Fed and recent inflation data that has led to calls for aggressive monetary tightening. But there are also other risks potentially spooking markets, including geopolitical tensions, rising energy prices, which would further pressure inflation, social unrest, including resistance to pandemic restrictions, the specter of antitrust action from the Biden administration, changes in tax policy, and so on. Our speaker for today's program will try to help us demystify some of these political risks that investors currently face, while also exploring possible outcomes that investors may not be giving adequate consideration. His presentation will primarily focus on the outlook for the 2022 midterms, the current regulatory environment, particularly as it pertains to mergers and acquisitions, fiscal policy, and geopolitics. He has a very deep and intimate knowledge of all things and all people associated with our nation's political process. It is our pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for today, Frank Kelly, founder and managing partner at Fulcrum Macro Advisors, an independent advisory firm that advises corporations, institutional investors with insights on public policy, global markets, and macroeconomics. His background is, let's just say, quite extensive, so here goes. Frank began his career as a writer for President Ronald Reagan and later served in the White House Office of Political Affairs. He continues as a writer for President George H.W. Bush and then served as a political appointee at the Justice Department in the Office of Policy Development. From there, Frank went on to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, where he was appointed senior policy advisor to the chairman and chief spokesman for the commission, as well as a member of the SEC senior staff. He then joined Merrill Lynch Investment Banking as chief of staff and global head of marketing for investment banking, sales, and trading. He later returned to Washington, D.C. to establish Charles Schwab & Company's first global government and regulatory affairs operation, where he served as both senior vice president and global head of government affairs, as well as the firm's first chief political strategist. In 2003, Frank joined Deutsche Bank as its first head of government affairs and then later global coordinator for government and public affairs. He was also the bank's first chief political strategist. In this role, he advised the bank's top institutional clients globally on U.S. and geopolitical issues. He also has extensive experience in mergers and acquisitions, establishing and heading up the bank's direct investment advisory group, where Frank and his team advised corporates on sensitive national economic security-related mergers and acquisitions that required approval from the U.S. Committee for Foreign Investment in the U.S. Frank is also a senior advisor to the Scowcroft Group, a global business advisory firm with an emphasis on emerging markets. In addition, Frank is an adjunct professor at the Catholic University School of Business, where he teaches coursework on business intelligence. He also regularly lectures on geopolitical risk at a number of business and law schools and has contributed to a number of policy studies on the intersection of global financial markets and geopolitics. He is also senior associate with the Americas program at the Center for International and Strategic Studies in Washington, where he focuses on Latin American politics, economics, and trade. Frank is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the American Council on Germany, and the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. He also serves as vice chair of the Jerome Leon Foundation of America. Now, before we begin this presentation, I'd just like to remind our audience that you're in listen-only mode. After the presentation, we will switch to Q&A. If you would like to submit a question to our speaker at any time during the presentation, please use the Q&A button within your Zoom webinar session. So Frank, I think I just about covered your full work history there. Welcome. We're happy to have you. And please take it away.
Gary, thank you very much for having me. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. If you're wondering, Gary, why he read the long version of my bio, he was bribed by my mother, who promised him one of her world-famous pies, and that's how it works these days. Good job, Gary. I'll tell her.
Thank you.
True. Well, there certainly is a tremendous amount going on here in the world. It's a little overwhelming. I never thought, certainly 3 months ago, I'd be sitting up to 3 in the morning, emailing back and forth with people in Berlin, Brussels, even contacts in Kiev as to what's going on the ground there. And here we are with all of that today. And then certainly, Washington, D.C., more than a year into the Biden administration, what's happening, what's not happening. And it's so confusing. In many ways, let me pull up my presentation here. I hope we're having a good discussion about this, and I'll just go right to it. But instead of just sort of giving you the same old political outlook, hopefully I'm going to be a little different here. I want to, and the goal of my business, what I do, and certainly what I did at Deutsche Bank, is sort of assessing the known unknowns, right? Let's try and get behind the curtain as to what is going on behind the scenes, and give more predictability to those things we see, but also searching for the unknown unknowns. I love that phrase, and that's Gary. Gary came up with that, and I stole it and copyrighted it. Sorry, Gary, but I'll give you some cut of that if I make money off of it. But what is it that we're missing? Because there's, as I find, I will go meet with hedge fund clients and others, and they're sitting there, 5 or 6 screens in front of them, all sorts of data flashing at them, and it's just overwhelming. The macro and microeconomic data, and then try and overlay that with corporate news, COVID news, and clearly people are missing things, and it's to be expected. Everybody's doing the best they can. I try and sort of fill that space as best I can. What are the unknowns? What else is happening out there trend-wise that is political, regulatory, fits in the geopolitical space? And maybe we will go through that today. To that point, in what I was saying here, where you walk in and you see the traders, right? There's so much coming into them. It's blinding. I call it the strobe light effect, right? It's as if people are staring at a strobe light and they're picking up some things in the room and some things they're not. Again, trying to cut through all of that. This is not a sales pitch, but I think if you feel this way, and I've done sort of unprofessional polling on this, but I've talked to probably close to 100 financial professionals just on this specific point, and everybody's feeling this way. They don't talk about it so much, and they're worried, right, as they are trading and their portfolio. I think we're all there, and it's tough, and people still working from home and trying to cut through this. So again, it is a strobe light effect. Hopefully, with COVID lifting, people returning to the office, that the strobe light starts to get turned down a little bit, and it's more of a straight up light. But let's see what happens. First, I want to sort of touch and keep this very market focused. There is a lot going on here. Let's start with the Federal Reserve. We're going from the Trump Federal Reserve, where literally every member of the Board of Governors was a Trump appointee from Jay Powell down. And in the course of the year, we're effectively completely a hockey line shift. And for you in Boston, I know you get that. I use that down south and people don't know what I'm talking about, but you get it, right? A whole hockey line shift of board members. Jay Powell was touch and go there for a while. There was serious debate within the White House whether to reappoint him or do somebody else. Do you come up with somebody who would be transformative in their views as the chair, or with inflation beginning to tick up and certainly, I don't want to call it raging, but certainly where it is at this point at over 7%, with supply chain issues, with all of the quantitative easing and having to shift out of that, do you keep what you got, right? Go with who you know, the steady hand who's there. And it was interesting. One thing about Joe Biden, President Biden, is the abundance of experience. I don't say that as an endorsement, but there's very few people in Washington that Joe Biden doesn't know or hasn't interacted with on multiple occasions. You're here 50 some years, it happens. I am, by the way, as you're looking at me outside of my natural long flowing hair and good looks, I am what you would describe as the perfect example of a swamp creature. I am a 5th generation Washingtonian and a 3rd generation who does politics and regulation for a living. Jay Powell is one of those creatures. Jay grew up here. A lot of people don't know that. Family grew up in Potomac, Maryland, which was farmland, which is now some of the most expensive real estate in the Mid-Atlantic. And Jay that now comes from money from that. But he grew up here. He went to Georgetown Prep. He went to the same school as Brett Kavanaugh. That got a lot of attention when Kavanaugh was coming up for confirmation. It's a great school, great, it's lost like Boston College prep, Jesuit, and it was the feeder into Georgetown University. It still is in many ways. He knows Washington in and out. I met Jay, and it's a small town. It's a very, very small town. It's like for all of you guys, many of you guys probably have known each other your entire professional career, know who each other is. That's the way DC is. I first met Jay 30 years ago. Was it 30 years ago? Almost 30. When I was at the Securities and Exchange Commission, I was introduced to him at a congressional hearing just beforehand. We were prepping where my boss, the chairman of the SEC, was testifying along with Jay, who was Undersecretary of Treasury for Domestic Finance. And it had to do with the Salomon Brothers case and rigging of the bond market and how to fix this. So Jay really knows his way around. Interestingly enough, though, back to Biden, they really didn't know each other. They may have met each other once, but not beyond that. But it goes to show what goes around comes around. People know each other, and everybody around Biden knew him well enough and liked him. He's an extremely likable person. What you see is what you get. He's very funny. He's even a little shy and a great guy. So you went with him. But the pressure was on, and this is something the Biden administration it's a theme. How do you deal with your left flank of your party, right? The progressives, who really want to see significant change at the Fed for a number of reasons. It was quite a battle over where Lael Brainerd would go. Would she get the chair? Was she progressive enough? Your Senator, Elizabeth Warren, sort of leading the fight in this effort, very much leading the fight. And instead, they decided that Lael should go for, as you know, vice chair for monetary policy. And Lael is very well known here in Washington. As is her husband, by the way, and just point this out, just goes to show again how tiny Washington is. And of course, you can walk from the Capitol to the Federal Reserve, one end of the city to the other, in about a half hour, right? If you're just having a leisurely stroll. Her husband, I always have to look up and double check on his name because I always forget. Is the chief Asia advisor to Biden. He is the Asia czar on all China policy at the National Security Council. And that, that's got to be some very interesting conversations over dinner in terms of what's going on with treasuries being bought by China, and what are you seeing in the market, honey, and what are you seeing on the geopolitical China front, honey, right? So it's a very interesting mix. But now we have where we are at this point with 1, 2, 3, 4 of these folks coming up right now. 5 actually, if you count Jay, up for confirmation. And there's been the kerfuffle yesterday where the Republicans walked out and wouldn't vote in the Senate Banking Committee. This gets to this issue of where is the Fed going? Now, behind the scenes, you see the chair of the Senate Banking Committee, Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio, the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, Congresswoman Maxine Waters from California. Their view is that the Fed has to change and the mandate has to change. They've actually introduced both of them in separate pieces of legislation, but kind of fit together. That they want to see the Fed do 2 things. One, that they, when in looking at monetary policy, overall economic data, that there be a specific focus on how the economy and how rates decisions impact minorities and the poor. And in fact, they want to actually legislatively change the Fed's mandate to include that. That's big, right? You're talking about a whole new division of people looking at this. The other piece of this is creating a digital wallet bank. Many of you have probably seen this and studying this, but they want the Federal Reserve to actually be a bank for the poor that creates digital wallets for poor folks who cannot afford regular bank accounts. Now, will that happen? At this point, I think doubtful, and we'll get to that because of the election, but it's still hanging there, and anything's possible in Washington, particularly legislatively. But it also goes to the selection of 2 of the other candidates, right? Professor Cook from Michigan State, Philip Johnson from Davidson University, Jefferson himself, who has devoted he's, as we all know, highly respected Fed economist on 2 occasions, and is the Dean of Academics at Davidson, I believe is his title. But he's devoted his life to the study of poverty and the implications of poverty, monetary policy. And very interestingly, what is the impact of poverty for wealth creation overall, right? Does poverty retard or restrict in a way that we actually make more money? The rest of us make more money. And if there's more equality, if you will, or equity, if you will, that the middle class actually makes more money if you lift that boat in some way for the poor. So very different thinking coming on board here to the Fed. The controversial one is Sarah Bloom Raskin for vice chair of supervision. And as you all know, we're replacing Randy Quarles, who just stepped down as vice chair. This is an incredibly powerful position post 2008, post the Dodd-Frank legislation. You are the super regulator, the most powerful of them all, not just for banking. Quite frankly, if Randy wanted to go in the direction, it would impact the insurance industry as well. And a lot of people don't realize because they're pretty quiet, but there's a sizable group within the Fed regulatory apparatus looking at the insurance industry, as well as the asset management industry. Anybody who would be deemed to be systemically important or globally systemically important, right? They're looking at all of that. Well, it very much is left up to who is sitting in that supervisory seat to enhance regulation. Raskin, as many of you saw and may have even read, I've read her pieces on this, has suggested that perhaps the Fed to accelerate the US meeting net zero carbon emissions, perhaps there should be pressure brought to bear by the Fed on large banks that are primary lenders to the oil and gas industry. Wow. Okay. Well, this gets you right into the politics and it gets you in there very deeply, right? You've got the oil and gas industry lobbying like the dickens to block her. They think they have enough votes in the Senate Banking Committee. And this gets to, we'll get into the politics and the elections, if you will, in a second, but and what's happening in Washington. But remember, it's a 50-50 Senate. How does that break out at the committee level, where you're baking the bread, right? You're getting the bread ready for the final bake off on the Senate floor. Well, all committees are broken up 50-50. And so there are different rules for some of these committees, but if you got a 50-50 and you can't vote the nomination out to tie vote, it can sit there, it delays it, etc. Here's the other big issue. Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia. That's one. Oil and gas king, right? That is the bread and butter of the state. He is also chairman of the Senate Energy Committee. It's not clear he's going to support Raskin's confirmation. He, in fact, before we got on the call here, was cornered by reporters and asked, and he said, yes, I have met with Ms. Raskin, and I have talked to her. It was no warm and fuzzy endorsement. He's sort of holding his breath on this one, and he's getting really pushed hard by the oil and gas industry, particularly back in the state, to vote against her. Here's the second big issue, which has not been widely reported and is really slowing things down in Washington, particularly from the congressional perspective. You've got it's the makeup of the Senate right now: 50 Republicans, 49 Democrats. Senator Ray Lujan, Democrat from Nebraska, unfortunately had a stroke about 3.5 weeks ago. He's expected to make a full recovery. He's actually done a video, to reassure people from his hospital, but he's still in the hospital. He probably will not be back in the job until April, maybe even May. So for now, Democrats are vote shy. Even if you've got the vice president, vice president can only vote if there's a tie. So unless you get a Republican coming on board, it makes it really, really, really hard. Bottom line here, we've got this all important Fed vote coming up in Fed meetings next month. I don't think any of these people are going to be confirmed in time for it. And part of that is because the Senate is going out of session next week for President's Day week. They go back, they're traveling around the world. They go back to their home state. And then after that, it gets a little dicey in terms of timing again. Can you work through all this before you actually have the Fed meetings? So you have Jay Powell, who is, yes, he is chair of the Fed for now, but it's an acting position. He's technically the acting chair. So I don't think any of these new folks will be brought to bear yet on this upcoming Fed vote, which it makes that even a little more interesting than we're already expecting. But the big question, of course, is, okay, let's just assume Raskin is confirmed. I think she's going to have a tough time. I think she's probably 45 to 50% chance of getting confirmed. And again, if Manchin's not there, it's not going to happen. But where are they going? Will she actually start to bring to bear the issue of debanking the oil and gas industry? She could. Once she's in there, Congress can't stop her. But it also gets to the larger issues here of regulators beyond and the coordination they're doing. What are they doing on some of these other big issues, such as crypto? The issue of digital wallets. Will they pursue this? They can. They don't necessarily need Congress to empower them to do that. They could pursue that themselves. I think crypto is going to be the really big one here. And I will say, while the market is pretty wild these days, and we're seeing all these different crypto companies pop up and et cetera, the ignorance level, certainly among Congress, I would even say many regulators, is quite high. What are we talking about? What is this? How are we regulating this? Isn't the currency the responsibility of the US government to issue it and manage it? How are we dealing with money laundering? How are we dealing with taxes? There's been incremental, and it's almost on a daily basis. If you're following this, you're probably seeing this, where the Federal Reserve is releasing white papers, where the SEC is talking about it, where they want to do regulation. The CFTC feels that they should be the primary regulator. The Treasury's on this. Long story short, regardless of who is in power in Congress come November, I'm going to predict by the end of the year, we're going to start beginning to see the template of significant regulation for the crypto industry going forward. One other thing that I think is important to remember when it comes to crypto and Washington, again, think of it, you're a senator, right? You've got, I'll pick on Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's extremely smart in financial services in our world. But she's dealing on a daily basis with farmers from the western part of Massachusetts. She's dealing with fishermen. She's dealing with the military because of bases in the state. She's dealing with infrastructure issues. She's dealing with healthcare issues. How many issues in a day can you address, right? And if it's not sort of pressing on you, if it's sort of not really sort of burning a hole in your pocket, you're not going to focus on it. Now, Senator Warren, to her credit, I think is probably one of the smarter folks in that space. But for the rest of them, they don't get it. And I would, as a case study, look at Facebook and the rollout that they did of their digital currency. Was it Libra 3 or 4 years ago? It was a disaster. They thought everybody would like it. They didn't go up and brief anybody. They didn't explain it to anybody. They didn't go and talk to the Fed about it before they started rolling it out. They called up for a congressional hearing. Yeah, this is going to be great. This is going to help people, and it's going to be our own currency. Oh, it's going to be based in Switzerland. Excuse me? No. Well, where is Facebook and their digital currency now? It's gone. They renamed it, rebranded it, and then have just sold it. It's gone. So there's a lot of risk here in the crypto space moving forward. And I think from a regulatory perspective, we're going to see a much more aggressive regulatory regime over the next 3 years of the Biden administration, regardless of who's sitting in control of the House and Senate. Let me move on from that, and I'm sure people will have questions about it, and I hope they do, but I'll move next. Congress. Covered a little bit of this, right? We've been seeing the dysfunction, but of course this dysfunction. It's a 50-50 Senate, and now it's a 50-49 Senate. There's been some significant achievements, whether it's COVID funding at the beginning of last year, the infrastructure bill, which was bipartisan. I know that there are Republicans in the House saying it wasn't. They all supported it until they didn't want to support it because they didn't want to give them a win. But it was bipartisan. You had, I think, at least 20 Republican senators in the Senate supported. A couple of important things about that to remember, and I think from an investment perspective, it's only the beginning, right? It's like any federal program. Once you get it rolling, where you're doing money for charging stations, where you're spending money to enhance broadband nationally, getting us to a broad 5G and prepping for 6G, where it's wind and it's solar and it's all of these other issues, right? It's not a one and done thing. It's next year there'll be more funding and the year after more funding. I would add to that, and where I think this is transformative, and I guess some in the market are getting it, the media is not talking about it anymore, is how the states and cities are now stepping up, right, in terms of spending to match, if you will. Seeing the federal government, okay, they're all in now. Now we're going to step up, and we have to for competitive purposes. If there's a company coming in from Sweden and they all have 5G and they want to set up some sort of significant operations in the state of Florida, and Florida doesn't have 5G, you're not going to get that foreign investment. So you've got all the states clamoring for this and trying to do more and more and more. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment when we get to sort of the unknown unknowns and what's happening there in terms of what I call neo-mercantilist policy, which is, it sounds sort of ethereal, but it's absolutely taking place and taking off. Of course, the big issue here is Build Back Better. And from a corporate perspective, not only was it the sustainability, other significant sustainable issues in there in terms of tax credits, et cetera, but it was the corporate tax issues. Very, very significant. Now, it's so far been a failure. I have been arguing with clients, I don't think for Democrats, failure is an option on Build Back Better. I suspect they're going to come back at this probably at the summertime. There are no formal talks, I'm using the air quotes there, but the reality is there is chatter. There is the periodic conversations with Joe Manchin and others. And I would point out the following. Taxes were never the problem. That was a gimme putt for the Democrats. Even Joe Manchin, who on Monday gave a talk and talked to reporters, hey guys, maybe we should just do the tax bill, the tax component of this. Whoa, Joe Manchin, we thought you hated Build Back Better. Well, I hated most of it, the child tax credit and all this other stuff. But on tax stuff, let's move. And let's move on this because maybe we can help drive down the deficit because rates are going up and we're going to have to be tending to that interest rate, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so if they move back, and I think we could end up seeing a Build Back Better, BBB light, and it will be significantly smaller. It could be anywhere from $500 million to $1 trillion. But all of the things that we talked about in terms of the corporate tax rate, in terms of the individual rate, in terms of doing away with carried interest, et cetera, all would move forward. And what the White House is beginning to look at is that this could be seen as a positive going into the midterms because you're raising all this extra revenue and that they would designate it for driving down the deficit. Okay, tax cuts and we're driving down the deficit. That could be a winner come November. So don't plan on this being dead and gone. Nothing ever really dies and goes away in Washington. It just kind of waits in the shadows with all the other swamp creatures to come out. Let me quickly go through the elections. Look, the polls are terrible. I've never in 30 years of doing this, and none of us have ever seen polls like this. I saw polls coming out of Los Angeles Times, University of Cal Berkeley that just were released yesterday. How badly Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Senator Dianne Feinstein from California, they're polling in the upper 30s in the state of California. Wow. I mean, how bad can this be? And of course, the drag on going in the midterms, where every member of the House of Representatives, all 435 are up, and 1/3 of the 100 senators are up. Add to that, we're approaching, I think we just passed 30 Democratic House members have already announced their intention to retire. And many of them are coming from moderate districts, which are purple in color, so to speak, where Republicans pick up. One, they don't want to lose. Two, many of them are frustrated and tired. This has been hard to be a congressman. Let's be honest, we all make fun of them and they drive us nuts and everything else. But with COVID, with being have to travel, with the way that they've been conducting business in the House, that's been very tough. They've been doing proxy voting for almost 2 years now, meaning one member can vote for 15, right? And that was one way to ensure that there was not too many people in the House floor. This has been a very disembodied experience for many of them, and they're just tired and want to move on. Where's this going to play out? If these polls hold, I think Republicans win a minimum of 50 seats in the House, minimum 50 seat pickup. Now, if you get Build Back Better light, if there are a couple other things here and Biden's polls go up and Democrats' polls go up, that number goes down. The Senate, I think Republicans are on track to win a net 2-seat pickup. It could be as many as 4, right? So a 54-46. So where does that leave us? Where's the Biden administration for the next 2 years, his final 2 years of his first term? I think Joe Biden, one thing he does have going for him, and what he doesn't have going for him. What he doesn't have going for him is he doesn't have good relationships with any of the Republicans in the House. That's clear and obvious. In the Senate, I think it's very different. Mitch McConnell will be majority leader again, and they actually are friends. And with a number of the other Republican senators, they get along with him. They've known him. He's one of theirs, right? And I think many of them don't want to see us getting back into impeachment stuff and investigations, and the country's sort of tired with that. So I think the Senate, working with Biden, could move on some things. And some of them are particularly back to this neo-mercantilist thing that I've been talking about, and I've mentioned, and I'll come back to that. But I think that's where we are at this point. One question, maybe I'm sort of front-running you. Do I think Joe Biden will run again? No, I do not. I know many people who've known him for decades, who've been quietly talking to him, don't do it again. But that begs the question, will he take that advice? And if it's not him, who? But we'll see. The other known knowns, of course, is what's happening globally, right? It's exhausting. It's ad nauseum what we're reading. Let me just quickly, because I've just been doing Ukraine and Russia around the clock for the past 2-3 weeks. I'm at 60% likelihood that Putin's going to invade. There are a number of things here to keep in mind. One, I don't see an off-ramp for Putin. How does he get out of this and save face? How does he not look like he is back down to the West? He is surrounded by people even more radically inclined than he is. How does the military do this? There's the great quote that former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates has reinvigorated. It's a quote by Talleyrand, who had been Napoleon's very mischievous and effective foreign minister. You can do anything you want with a bayonet other than sit on it. Meaning you can't amp up your military and just have them sitting there and then just pull them back, right? It's like having a boxer all ready to go in the ring and say, you know what, we're going to reschedule this for some other time. That doesn't really work. I see the things that are going on at this point. I am very concerned. The false flag issue is very real. Russian media is starting to ramp up stories of potential atrocities. There is an increase in artillery shelling on the Donbass region, started by the Russians, the little green men, the separatists, if you will, that is, they call them, even though they're Russian. And what are we dealing with Putin? In terms of false flag, I'm reminded, and I was reminded by a friend of mine who is an intelligence officer here with a certain intelligence agency, who reminded me of the story of Putin back in 1999. And this was the famous, but now forgotten, Russian apartment buildings. And this is where a series of explosions hit 4 separate apartment buildings in 3 cities. Over 300 people were killed. Putin was prime minister at the time. His reaction, his extraordinary response, which looked like he was ready for it, propelled him to the presidency, which he's held ever since effectively. And there's no doubt, and US intelligence has zero doubt, Putin did it, right? He was willing to sacrifice 300 Russians in a false flag effort to seize power, and that was in 1999. So I don't know, and this is also, by the way, how it triggered the Chechen war, which was unbelievably savage, right? Because they blamed it on the Chechens, even though there was no proof there. I'm very concerned about this, that in many ways, people are asking, what's the implications of this from a market perspective? It's enormous. It's, of course, the gas issue. It's oil. The United States actually imports a significant amount of oil, certain brands, form of oil from Russia. Other countries do as well. It's wheat production, right? Ukraine is one of the largest providers, the largest grower of grain in the grain in the world. Egypt, where the primary staple, food staple, is bread, is the largest importer. What's the implications there, right? Do you end up seeing social unrest 6 months from now because you don't have enough wheat? How do you, what do you do with this? With Russia and Ukraine, phosphates that are necessary for fertilizer because they're one of the largest deliverers of fertilizer in the world. And what does that do to food security? Oil, of course, and gas being cut off from Russia. What's the implications for China? Now, the interesting thing to this is our belief is China's watching this carefully, and there are two minds. One, they kind of like that he's standing up to the West, but two, they really don't like it because they don't want the disruption to their economy. They don't want Russia now becoming heavily dependent on them for the only place where they can find financing, the only place where they might be able to get semiconductors, which is not easy for the Chinese to get themselves, on and on and on and on. And most of all, it's putting tremendous focus on China. Okay, if they do this with Ukraine, is China going to attack Taiwan? They don't like that, right? They don't want everybody focusing on that because it adds to the criticism. And on top of it, they're in pretty bad moods because the Olympics have stunk for them, right? There was a fantastic piece in the Financial Times today. They basically budgeted $3 billion to spend to prepare for the Olympics. They're over $9 billion in spending. And all they've gotten out of it is pretty negative press on human rights issues and any other number of issues. But there's a lot here that is, I think, going forward, North Korea and Iran. And all of those scenarios change when we see what the final outcome here is in Ukraine. And I think if Ukraine is going to happen, most likely in the next 5 days. After that, Ukraine becomes a mud pit because everything begins to thaw. And any of you have been out in the Midwest and walk through the mud fields out there, it's a whole different kind of mud than the East Coast. It's like walking through cement. I've been out there and literally walked through fields when I was duck hunting this time last year. It was every time you put your foot down, you had to use your hands to pull the leg out. And it would be like 5 pounds of mud on you. It's terrible. Same thing with Ukraine. You can't move an army through that. Which then begs the question, is there a chance that this is prolonged? Does this get us into Putin sits there and waits for warmer weather, drier weather, and we're still seeing tensions into the summertime? There's serious risk of that. Being cognizant of time here, let's see, where am I here?
Frank, we'll go ahead and run this poll and definitely.
Oh, please, yes.
Yes, time is always of the essence, but as I will say, the presidential elections in recent memory have gone very late into overtime. Unlike back in the day when you started, Frank, the results were already figured out before bedtime. So it's a different game today, different ball game. So I'm going to run the first poll here, and actually go back one slide, Frank. So it's the midterm election prediction, and I'm just curious to hear the audience's take on this. This is, if you can go back one slide, Frank, I think you're one slide ahead.
Sorry.
That's okay. Historically, the party in the White House just suffers a defeat or sees an erosion of power in Congress in the first midterm election. We've seen that in 2018. We saw that in 2010. Remember that back in 1994, I believe. 2002 was kind of an oddball because the Republicans actually picked up seats, but there was a lot of drama mixed in with that was 9/11 as well. But if you remember, there was also 50-50 Senate at that time, and there was a Republican senator that switched to an independent. I think it's the late Jim Jeffords.
Yes.
So it caused a lot of drama at that time. But one thing I will point out that's interesting about this, and I would say almost 2/3 of you are already thinking that Republicans will take control of the House and Senate. So I'm going to end this poll. I'll just go to give a few more seconds here. But one thing interesting about this, Frank, is that some of these seminal pieces of legislation, whether it was healthcare in 2010, the tax reform in 2018, didn't help out. It was usually, I don't know in the case of tax reform, but the Tea Party movement was born out of the healthcare law. And so those did not help out the incumbent in the White House. Let me go ahead and display the results here. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, but over 2/3 of you think the Republicans will take back the House and Senate. Almost a third of you think that it'll kind of be split between the two. I was kind of surprised by the 50 seat, your prediction of around 50 seats being picked up by Republicans in the House. And you mentioned that there's a lot of retirements. I think that was also an issue back in 2018 as well. One of the most notable ones was Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House.
Well, quickly, I'm glad you bring that up, because remember, everybody, too, and I should have pointed this, and I apologize, because of the census, we're going through redistricting, right? So more traditional Democratic states, Illinois, New York, California, have lost seats, and Arizona, Texas, Florida, South Carolina, they picked up seats. So all in all, for now, we're still working through it state by state, because each state has to figure out their redistricting. A week ago, interestingly enough, they thought Democrats would actually pick up 11 seats. I think that's going to go away, and it's going to be slightly tilted for Republicans that they pick up a couple extra seats through the redistricting and the gerrymandering, but we'll see how that plays out.
Definitely. Let's move to the next poll question here, which, Frank, you kind of stole this from me, the front runner for 2024. And I thought this was a bit of a provocative question. So if we can go to the next slide here, I'll go ahead and launch the poll here. As Frank had mentioned, he doesn't think Joe Biden's going to run in 2024. Now, I'm going to add to this, and the reason why I put this poll question in, so I saw a piece in the Wall Street Journal, an op-ed, suggesting that Hillary should make a comeback in 2024. I'm not here to debate the probability of that happening, but I will say there's a reason why the thought is even coming up. And if it is coming up, there are some implied bets in there. Number one, Joe Biden's not going to run, and we can probably explain it, or when I say we as the Americans can probably take the explanation, not trying to show party affiliation here, but the Democrats can also explain why he's not going to run. And we know for a fact he didn't want to run in 2016, but of course there's a good reason why there. That was really set up for Hillary. But in 2024, if he's not going to run, then, and you're suggesting someone else is going to come in, then what do you say about Harris? Now, you mentioned an important point here about the popularity. Harris, during the presidential primaries, she dropped out, if everyone recalls, before the first Democrat primary for president. So it's interesting to see that so the question, I guess, for you is, how does the party explain that? Because they got themselves, I personally think they're kind of in a pickle here. If we remember the presidential election, after New Hampshire, Biden was left for dead. And there was a story I heard that during the inauguration, former President George W. Bush went to Adam Clyburn, who's an influential figure in the African-American community, and said to him, "You saved us." I don't know if you recall that story, but in the sense that because he threw his support behind Joe Biden, and Joe Biden was became the front runner that helped save his campaign. I'm going to just read the poll result here. I'm going to share it with everyone. 86% of you think it's going to be someone else in 2024. That is incredible. So, Frank, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. And I know we're kind of running short on time, but we definitely have some flex time here, because I know that everyone in the audience you'll definitely want to get your input in on this as well. I'll let you take it away.
And apologies for going long here. For the next 3 hours of my presentation, sorry. Look, I can't explain what's happened with Vice President Harris. Her poll numbers are appalling. And for why, right? She's not a person on the front line every day. And it just isn't working for her. And I don't know what's happening. By the way, there's been an increased chatter among the Washington folks that Biden will want to put her up for the Supreme Court seat, right? And that there's pressure on her to take it so that he can get somebody else in there. And I do think that there's a lot of, if Biden decides not to run again, and even if Harris runs, it's going to be like the Oklahoma land rush. You're going to see 15 or 20 Democrats running for it. And why not? Because Donald Trump broke the mold. If he could get elected, anybody can get elected. If he can run, anybody can run. What's the downside, right? Unless you do something so incredibly stupid that you're ruined forever. So, and I think that money doesn't matter so much anymore. We don't talk about that anymore, but money doesn't matter as much because of social media. You can do so much with so little. And here we ran an
Frank,
election in the middle of COVID.
how do the party bosses though explain? I mean, this is, you know, as someone that is now the first female vice president, how do they explain, well, this person's not going to be the front runner in 2024? That's the thing I'm trying to figure out here, because if they're making talk about, well, Hillary can make a comeback or someone else can make can come and take the lead, because if you remember after 2016, the big question whenever a party suffers defeat is, well, who's going to be the leader of the party going forward? And usually they look towards the newer generation, the younger crop, if you will. But how does a party explain away, you know, that Harris would not run? Would you?
I think that a couple thing is, you say party bosses, and I think this is important. I see both parties very fractured, right? There are a number of people in the Democratic Party who just don't like her. It's a personal thing. There are those who are more moderate, think she's too progressive. There are progressives who don't think she's too moderate. And she has not been able to define herself, and she's had so much problems within running her office. I mean, I think there's like 20 or 30 staffers have already cycled through the office. I mean, things have to calm down for her. And I can't figure out, this isn't that hard, but she seems to be, it's like that baseball outfielder. He drops the ball once and all of a sudden it's error after that. Just can't get the mojo back. Something's got to sort of kickstart it.
Gotcha.
I also think that, by the way, let's put it out there. Everybody's expecting Trump to be out there. I'm gonna make the prediction Donald Trump is not the nominee. And not only that, I'm going to make a prediction that he doesn't run. Because one, you're not seeing the poll numbers. Poll numbers are beginning to deflate on him. And the chatter behind the scenes, even among those who were Trumpers, they want something different. They want to move on. They don't want to talk about the election being stolen, right? They want something else. And I think we could see some really big changes here in the party. And the other thing is, this is basic marketing, right? Everybody loves their car. They got a new car, and they got it 4 years ago, and they're really proud. And all of a sudden, there's a new car that comes out, new variation, the new thing. I think that was the title of a great book. And yeah, they may like Hillary, they may like Trump, but wow, this model, this is cooler. This is the future. I want to latch on. Who that is in either party, I don't know. But there's tremendous opportunity for somebody there.
Great. I'm going to drop off to let you continue because for time here. So, all right.
Sorry, guys, and I don't want to rush through this too fast, but I'll try and speed it up here because I want to be respectful of your time. What are we keeping our eyes? What are the unknown unknowns? And I've talked about the neo-mercantilistic activity here, and I think this is very important for the market. And I'm not seeing a lot being written here. What has certainly happened because of COVID, because of the U.S.-China fighting and everything else, we're seeing this whole idea of pulling back from China and bringing it all back home. Well, this is intensifying because of the tensions with China, because of what's happening with supply lines, talking about what's happening with Russia because of sanctions and everything else. And what is happening, this started under Trump and it's been continued under Biden. It's very bipartisan. First thing I'm going to talk about is there's something floating around out there right now that's just passed the House of Representatives, and a version of it already passed the Senate. They're going to come up and get this done probably in the next 2 months. For now, it's called the CHIPS Act. That's an acronym for something very long. But what is it? You're talking hundreds of billions of dollars being spent by the federal government to pay corporates to re-domicile to the US, to build what's happening. The perfect example of this already is what just was announced in Ohio, where Intel, $20 billion of chip building facilities in Ohio, and the state of Ohio put $2 billion in. If the CHIPS Act had been passed, the federal government probably would have kicked in $6 billion for that. Build it, bring it back. We'll enhance education, we'll enhance infrastructure, but we have to do it here. Well, this is incredible. It's subsidization of some of the most profitable business out there. The pharmaceutical industries will be a huge winner of this. The research and development world writ large, universities, the amount of money that will be put in to do that and then have the spin-offs as long as they stay here. This is wildly bipartisan, wildly. Everybody wants it. It's the only way we can compete with China. Now you're beginning to see the same thing de facto. There's a CHIPS Act in the EU. They're doing the exact same thing. We have to have all this technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Japan spending billions just this past week for semiconductors. I'm just picking on semiconductors. It's anything that is a critical function of our future business-wise. And add into this critical minerals. How do we get them? How do we preserve them? How do we stockpile it? Energy, right? We don't want to be importing it in any way, shape, or form. The broadband aspect, the amount of money we're spending to compete with China, not just on 5G, the amount of chatter in Washington already about 6G and 7G. I don't know what that's going to do. I mean, is that going to be like implanted in my brain at that point? I can't even comprehend what 7G is going to be like. Again, the federal government stepping in and spending this money. This is incredible, right? Add to this what we're already seeing with venture capital and private equity and the amount of money into all of this. This is the future, and it's here already. Other things that we're watching is antitrust, and again, mindful for time. You have an aggressive, aggressive element, if you will, that Biden has pursued in terms of competition. That he sees antitrust legislation, law that we have used for 40, 50 years, it's not good anymore. It doesn't deal with the Googles and the Amazons, and it needs to be rewritten. So where are we? Two things to watch. The Senate is moving on very bipartisan antitrust legislation that would directly go at Google, Apple, Facebook, not Microsoft. Interestingly enough, Microsoft has had a very quiet hand in crafting legislation. Interesting. That's one big thing. The other one is the Federal Trade Commission, relatively sleepy organization that reviews transactions, usually hand in hand with the antitrust division of the Justice Department, which has also gotten a very new aggressive Jonathan Cantor person in there, who's been charged by President Biden, go for it. Go after Amazon, go after all of these big things. You've seen the president certainly talking about inflation, worried about the meat industry and that they're not competitive. He wants to blow it all up, and really we need a new antitrust framework. My understanding, to give you an example, is Federal Trade Commission has a 32-year-old, very smart 32-year-old chair, Lena Khan. Not an antitrust expert by trade, a law firm, something like that. I'm told by antitrust lawyers here, as of 2 months ago, there were at least 80 deals, significant sized deals, right? There's a threshold, you've got several $billion dollars, you have to go to the Federal Trade Commission, present. Either you announce it and bring it, or what they often like to do is sort of quietly pre-bake it. Bring it to Federal Trade Commission and say, we want to announce this and we want to see if you have concerns. At least 80 deals as of 2 months ago was the statistic floating around that had been nixed, been said, no, don't even bring it back. We're not going to let it happen. We just saw Lockheed, first time I can ever remember, a major defense industry trying to buy Aerojet. This deal was blessed by all 5 services, Marines to Air Force to Space Force, and the Secretary of Defense. They all signed off on it. Federal Trade Commission blocked it. I've never seen a major defense deal blocked by the Federal Trade Commission. This is something very new, and the market is not understanding this. Add to this antitrust elements in Europe, where they're doing much of the same, but it's more because they're trying to grow some sort of significant tech industry there versus the Googles and everybody else that dominate. So I think you're going to see competition here get blown open. That's the goal of the Biden administration. That Amazon, what happens to them? Amazon is attempting to buy MGM. That's still pending. Where does that go? So I think that's a big, big thing here that's going to really change the face of the market and deals going forward. It already is, but nobody's seeing it. Let's see, where am I next? I think this is my last one. Look, the other thing that we're watching is Latin America. When you see and start breaking it down, where China is all over Latin America, as they have been in Africa, because of the natural resources. Something like 40 or 50% of the lithium necessary to make electric batteries, the resources are in Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil. Chinese are all over it. Where's the US in this? Now, you're also beginning to see in Central America a number of problems where, and this is where so much of the illegal immigration crossing our borders is coming from, because they're just lawless states effectively. But what we're missing is people don't understand that China is in there in a big way, trying to build ports, and ports that are not just for commercial, but they would be able to keep their navy at. Wow, what happened to the Monroe Doctrine? And of course, we've seen Russia now working with Nicaragua, Venezuela, of course, with Cuba. This is the new great game, and that's a reference to what we saw certainly in the last century. The great game was the stands, Kazakhstan, everything else, where it was Russia and Turkey and the UK all fighting over Afghanistan and everything else. I think this is going to be the big focus of this administration, the next administration. How are we better aligning ourselves commercially and politically to push the Chinese out, to keep the risk of Russia out, and develop these markets? And they're so critical for the sustainable efforts that we have underway. Was that the last one? Other ones that we're watching here very quickly, and I've mentioned this a moment ago, and boy, I love these graphics here that you created for me. Africa, the time is now. There's so much going on there, and we've mentioned you've got through the Belt and Road Initiative, China's all over Africa. That isn't for political purposes. It's because they desperately need the natural resources. We now have Russia deeply engaged in Africa, right? There's in the country of Mali, where there's a significant ISIS and Al Qaeda presence and growing. It's the next Afghanistan, I fear. France was in there. Mali just kicked the French out effectively and hired the Russian mercenary group known as the Wagner Group to take these people out. But it's because of the critical resources. And Africa is really coming into its own. I'd note that even this morning, that there was a meeting between the European Union and the African Union, right? Which the African Union aspires to be something like the European Union in Brussels, to which the EU has just committed $169 billion for infrastructure and sustainable development in Africa. Europe is increasingly looking to the continent as the future, as the major trade partner. And considering the demographics, considering the opportunities, considering how critical they are for sustainability and for to preserve it as well, Africa is coming in. I think this is going to be a huge investment opportunity over the next five to 10 years. So we'll see how that plays out. But this is one I'm watching very carefully. I think I'm at the end. Oh, I'm sorry. One last thing. Cyber warfare. We're going to watch this. If Russia goes in, you're going to understand how serious this is. Ransomware, critical thing here. A friend of mine is a Wall Street Journal reporter, covers ransomware, said it's shocking the number of companies that actually pay a ransom, never report it to the FBI or others. This is beginning to really bite into companies. It's just below these guys, these sort of cyber pirates understand the threshold in which a company has to explain or report expenditures, right? Where does this amount of money go for, and they don't want to say that's what it went to. So keep it low and pay it out. This is just an explosive business. We're going to see more and more of this, and particularly as the geopolitical issues, China, Russia, and others, Iran, continue to ramp up. This is going to become another big thing, and I think a huge business opportunity. Last one, sorry. I'll leave it this. This is going to be the fascinating thing, where the US is going through the huge churn, right? This is from the census. This is where people moved. in the last year and a half, 2 years. This, of course, changes everything. The demographics, the politics, the reddest of states are now a little more pinkish. I would argue some of the bluest of states are going to be a little bit more red. Look what happened in San Francisco. If anybody you watched, where they just did a recall of 3 Board of Education folks there, they were stunning numbers. I think this is what we're seeing. And I think in many ways, I'm very hopeful of this actually, because I think this actually is the great equalizer. It's sort of like turning over your garden at the end of the year, so it's more fresh. It's better when the flowers bloom in the spring. I think this is actually going to be a big positive. But this changes a lot, of course, and people don't understand what this means in terms of the brain drain, what this means in terms of new opportunities and places where they've been drained. Who doesn't want to live in San Francisco, right? It's a beautiful place. Who doesn't want to live in Boston? I love Boston. I lived in Boston. I think this is a huge, fascinating, and it will be a historic event that will have enormous impact for the markets going forward in the years to come. Anyway, I'll stop there. I have gone over and I apologize.
No worries. It's all good. Definitely appreciate the conversation, Frank. It's an absolute pleasure. And I want to thank the audience for sticking around with us. We're going to try to get through questions quickly here through Q&A. So just remember, I've seen some questions come through the chat. If you could please just try to submit your questions using the Q&A button. It's a little bit easier to track versus using the chat box. I would appreciate it if you could do that, and we'll try to get through your questions as soon as possible. Frank, maybe we can kick things off with another poll questions, if you don't mind. Do you mind going back to the slide it's the poll question on what will decide the 2022 midterm election? And I'll go ahead and pull up, this one right here. So let me go ahead and run that poll. The issue that decides 2022. And as you said, I think we learned a lot from Brexit, that these polls that we see in the press don't mean much, but there are some interesting insights we can glean from recent polling figures. But let's just let everyone kind of get through and vote, submit their vote.
You bring up by the way, you wrote this, full credit everybody. He wrote this. I think this is brilliant. And you get to a very important question too, in terms of polling and how do you poll? Right? I mean, when I was a kid, somebody would show up at your door, or somebody would call on the phone, and your mother or father would answer and go through the questions. Now we have caller ID. Nobody picks up the phone, and God help you if some strange guy with a clipboard shows up in the front door, knocks on the door, he's probably going to get maced in the face. So it makes polling really hard.
It does. It does. I'm going to say right now, over 3/4 of you think inflation, the economy, not a big surprise there, is going to really have an impact on the midterms this year. We had a market strategist back in December talking about how, bringing up the example of how inflation was a major overhang for then President Jimmy Carter. But I do think that there might be some interesting nuances or things that maybe we're not considering in this go around. First off, let's just kind of back up here. I'm going to take this poll down so I can kind of see what's going on here. I want to maybe actually jump into the Senate. We talked about kind of the dicey nature of the Senate and Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin actually has been calling on the Fed, basically saying enough's enough. Let's start tightening here. There have been other figures in Washington D.C. that have been doing that. So in essence, whereas years ago that was considered a taboo thing, particularly when Trump was present, kind of a taboo thing to put pressure on the Fed. Now the Fed's being politicized, right? And I guess the question for you is, to what extent is the Fed now becoming somewhat of a political institution? If these folks like Manchin himself are trying to put the pressure on Jerome Powell to take some action on this. The other thing I would also add too is that a lot of experts out there have said that, well, these guys are just doing what's the most politically savvy thing for them to do, and it's because their constituents feel this. But is there something else they're worried about? I mean, Manchin is a bit of a fiscal hawk, and is he saying enough's enough? We got to figure out how to pay our bills, or I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on this in terms of the political spotlight that's being shined on the Fed.
So, Gary, and by the way, again, kudos on these great polls that you put together. The fascinating thing is, forever, Congress never paid attention to that. Forever, right? And you and I, when we were prepping for this, I think I told you the story. It was fascinating when inflation started rearing its head, and I'd be having conversations with members of Congress and their staff, and you could quickly ascertain how old they were if they were on the phone, if you're on the phone with them. Oh, they're well under 50. Because eventually the question would come around and be like, so Frank, what is the real risk here of inflation? And by the way, what is inflation? You were not around in the mid 70s, right? So this has been a rude awakening for a lot of these folks, this thing called inflation. And who's in charge of it? Oh, it's the Fed. So this has created, to your point, the politicization of the Fed, right? There was nothing more boring and less attended than the Humphrey Hawkins testimony, biannual, right? Who cared? Now it's like the Super Bowl on Capitol Hill. And I don't think this goes away because these members of Congress, again, they don't understand the economics. You can find 8 million guys and gals with law degrees in DC. You don't find many economists, so they don't know what's going on, and they're getting pounded at home. I mean, I don't know what oil and gas prices are up there, but I went and filled up my car the other day, and it was $4.46 a gallon. All right, and this is before we hit $98 a barrel. Oh.
I would definitely, I think we all concur that given our fiscal health, the fiscal health overall for our country, there's not a lot of knowledgeable folks that are knowledgeable in economics. Real quick question here regarding the Republican Party. We talked about earlier the leadership of the Democratic Party, particularly in 2024. One question is, which Republican Party will prevail in 2022 and 2024? Is it the establishment, traditional stalwarts, or will it be the Trump acolytes? Curious to hear your opinion on this.
My view is a lot of the Trump acolytes they're just angry, right? That they're kind of Reagan people who like smaller government, a strong defense, all of the basics, right? But they're angry and they can't stand Washington, what Washington's doing. If you can find somebody, let's remember, George H.W. Bush ran on a campaign of kinder, gentler. Kinder and gentler than Ronald Reagan? Okay.
His son had compassionate conservatism too. You remember that?
Right? So we kind of go back and forth a bit here. And it depends on the mood of the country. And the polling numbers are beginning to say people don't like hearing about the whole idea of stealing the election. I'm not here to argue whether it was stolen or not. But that's saying to me, they want to move on. They want to know the future. And so who is that candidate who can stand up and tap into that mood? And does Trump go there? I don't think he does. I don't think he can. And therefore, to your question, knowing that there's quite a split, I think they can find somebody potentially in the middle. Who is that? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Just to kind of piggyback off of that, I do agree. I think that the both parties have seen a fundamental shift. If you go back 2 decades ago, when the Bush tax cuts was passed, there were, I think, a handful of Democrats in the Senate that went along with the final passage of that bill. Whereas today, it's just straight party line. You'll never, I don't want to say you'll never, but it's the bill in 2017 was just strictly party line, and the Republicans had to make sure they shored up the Jeff Flakes, the Bob Corkers, and even John McCain. And I remember that time there was health issues among some of the Republican senators. McCain, I remember during the floor vote, was brought in on a wheelchair. He had injured himself, and then Johnny Isakson was dealing with skin cancer at the time. So there's a lot of drama around this process. But what I would also add too is I've been seeing a lot of analysis lately as regarding just the demographic headwinds and tailwinds. We're hearing a lot about the Hispanic vote and how that has now starting to be leaning more into GOP's favor. And interestingly enough, in one of the articles I read, the number 2 issue behind the economy is border security amongst the Hispanic vote. Now, if we look at 2020, despite losing, Trump did outperform or perform better than expected in the Hispanic community. And if you look in Florida, for instance, he tripled his margin and did really well in the Miami-Dade County, which is a very strong Democratic stronghold. So do you tend to concur with this early signs that we're seeing of a demographic shift? You had that map up there in terms of the migration, where the red states become pink and the blue states kind of move more towards purple, let's say. Do you think demographics will be a factor there as well?
I do think demographics are a huge factor. I'm not quite certain why, to my mind, the Democratic Party has somewhat ignored Latino vote. Black Lives Matter and what we saw through the Black Lives Matter movement, which is still going on. It's important. I think it's massively reframed the way many people think and perceive things. But Latino lives matter too. I'm not trying to stir anything up, but there's more. There's huge. I don't know if there's more Latinos than there are African Americans, but certainly they're dealing with discrimination. Mm-hmm. They weren't part of the process, right? I think that's driven some of them to the Republicans. The border security issue, and you raised Florida with Trump, true. But that wasn't true for Latinos in Arizona. And that's one of the reasons he lost it. And which goes to show that both parties are not looking at the Latino community properly as if us saying, well, the Europeans. Well, wait a minute. There's the Irish, there's the Italian, there's the French, there's the German, and they all have different issues, right? And God knows, I'm talking to everybody in Boston, and I'd love to know what the count is of Irish Americans here, right? What Ireland meant and what US policy towards Ireland meant, right? It wasn't a homogeneous thing. Meaning, Florida, that was heavy Venezuelans. It was the Cuban community, Nicaragua, right? Those people love Trump. Now, the border security thing, I think, bothers a number of Latinos because some of them, yes, they feel so sorry for the folks who are coming up, most of them Guatemala and everything else. But for those who got here legally, it really bothers them that there's other folks coming the other way. And now they're competing with them. I don't like that.
Yeah. We're going to jump around the map, pun intended, and switch to geopolitics here. We had a question regarding Kazakhstan, and the question is, what is a play with Kazakhstan and the current events there? Is it a play or China, Russia, or the U.S.? The Kazakhs have a plethora of natural resources, importantly oil and gas and other minerals, using modern weapons and technology. What is your take on the recent events in Kazakhstan?
That question came from James, and that is an awesome question. Because I sort of raced through it because I was so long-winded before. This is the unknown unknowns, and you're hitting exactly on it, right? Kazakhstan, when you break down the natural resources coming out of there and how incredibly important it is to the global economy. What did Russia do? I mean, clearly there was an uprising. How much of it was also instigated by the Russians because it was Russian troops who went in there and created peace again. And quite frankly, Kazakhstan is now completely in the orbit of Russia, just like Belarus is now when it wasn't a year ago after uprisings. This is gravely concerning to the Chinese because they share a border with Kazakhstan and they've got enormous investments there as well. But it comes down to, and James points out so well, it's the natural resources. I'm going to say something that's going to sound completely crazy. Does anybody, if people may remember this, do you remember when Donald Trump threw out there that he wanted to buy Greenland? And it was like, wait, what did the president of the United States just say? And everybody's like, he's nuts. What is this? Like commercial real estate? He didn't explain it well. It's one of the most resource intense for the most critical. He was serious, right? And there's nobody there. And who's in there mining? The Chinese. The very stuff that we need for all of this, wind turbines, jets, everything else. So this is really, the money and the natural resources driving a lot of these geopolitical tensions and are going to continue to drive.
Gotcha. We've got, we'll try to go for another, let's say 10 minutes. And I think maybe we can switch to another poll question here, if you don't mind. I'm going to pull up the poll here, and it's regarding the corporate tax rate. And I don't have it on my screen here, but I'll just read it out to you. What is the probability of an increase in the corporate tax rate in the next 2 years? I'll go ahead and launch that poll. The options are greater than 75%, between 25 and 75, and below 25. And you have to forgive me, I put these numbers in there, so I just want to see, is it a high likelihood, low likelihood, or somewhere in between? Curious to know everyone's thoughts. Now, Frank, just while we're waiting for these results to come in, you remember the 2017 and when tax reform was pushed through, the permanent part of that reform was the corporate side, if you recall, and the sunset was implemented on the individual side. And that's not a surprise because the individual side makes up the bulk of tax receipts. I think it's about 85% individual, 15% corporate, and then within individual, it's split between income and payroll tax. So obviously, if you want to push that through reconciliation, you got to sunset the individual component. And on the flip side too, businesses want some certainty there. So I guess the question going forward is, with you're communicating to investors, you're communicating with businesses, your certain clients and so forth. And by the way, I'm just going to pull the poll up here. I'm going to finish it and share the results. Most of you, or a plurality of you, think that it's going to be kind of between some 25 and 75%. So there is some probability there. 41% of you think it's going to be 25 to 75. 21% think it's going to be greater than 75%. And interestingly enough, 38% think it's below a 1 in 4 chance. In your view, is there any push by the business community to say, don't mess with this, work on this, or do something else to kind of reform the system? Is there, because it seems that, with all the initiatives that we talked about, such as the onshoring that requires investment, the U.S. has to kind of be competitive, if you will, from a tax standpoint. And that was really the big thrust of the 2017 bill. So I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts on this, because it does kind of create a cloud of uncertainty for businesses.
Businesses, I think, were prepared to see the corporate rates go up. That was then, this is now. And I think that's not the case so much. They saw which way the wind was beginning to blow with the OECD Accord on international taxes. But again, that was then, this is now. And they see this 50-50 Senate, someone like Joe Manchin, yes, he's calling for higher tax rates. Kristen Sinema there? Yes, I think so. But I think everybody may be putting this on hold until we get a better sense of where the economy is and when this is going to start to even out, when we start see inflation coming back down. But again, as I mentioned earlier, there is this growing sentiment in the Senate among Democrats, led by Joe Manchin being out there talking about, we're going to have to start paying down the deficit. We're going to be paying exponential amounts of money servicing the debt. So I think that is one thing that's more baked in with the corporates, but they're pushing back like they weren't pushing back 6 months ago. The other issues like carried interest, R&D tax credits, things like that, they're in there fighting really hard to either make sure that the R&D is included, that carried interest is not taken away, right? And I think they are scaring the heck out of a lot of members of Congress. We better not we better be careful about this and understand the economy first. And again, most of these guys slept through their economics classes in college.
Yeah. I can imagine that. We got a little bit of time here. I want to throw out a question here on healthcare. Where do we stand today on the whole healthcare debate? During the election, there was a lot of push for single payer and so forth. That clearly a move in that direction threatens an industry out there. So I'm sure it's on a lot of investors' mind, but we haven't heard about it lately. What is right now the latest, and is it something to contemplate in the next few years?
I would contemplate in the next few years if Democrats hold Congress.
Okay.
But it's weirdly not being discussed. I thought this was going to be the big push. I thought this was going to be absolutely in the Build Back Better. This was a budget reconciliation, and it's just dead for now. And we saw a single payer effort in California that they just tried, and that died at the last minute on the House, the California State Legislative floor. So for now, it's just not right there. It's just not there.
Okay. Super helpful. All right, I think that's about it. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time to listen in on this presentation today. I know we kind of went long here, but thank you so much, Frank, for taking the time to do this, to speaking to our members. And before we go, just some major takeaways. If you could just kind of sum up your main takeaways as we kind of ride out this wild year, what would they be?
I think that the major takeaways is that we are going to see, first and foremost, from a market perspective, huge shifts in terms of government intervention to encourage development and competition, and particularly in the tech sector. And nobody's talking about it, and because it's Republicans and Democrats together, and they're all trying to bring in their state. It's huge. It's not going away. Sustainable investment will continue apace significantly to encourage more and more of it. But again, that nearshoring, onshoring, right? Latin America is going to become much more, and Africa, these two countries, because of their natural resources, are increasingly critical for industry going forward. And therefore, the geopolitics, the games played are going to ramp up considerably. And finally, the elections. if things hold where they are, and God knows we've discovered, a week we're almost like living in dog years, right? It's this, everything changes so fast. Who knows where we are in 3 months from now? But if the numbers hold, you're going to see a big sweep for Republicans in the House and the Senate. And then at that point, you believe it or not, because of Joe, this is where Joe Biden, the old legislative war dog, if he can work out bipartisan deals, there's some things can get done here. It's not just going to be complete gridlock.
Gotcha. Super helpful. Thanks again for making this presentation, and best of luck with all the client inquiries regarding Ukraine. If there is an invasion, I tip my hat to you for handling all that stuff in the middle of the night. Well, thank you to our members for joining us for today's program. Remember to visit our website, cfaboston.org. You can see the website right there, right below me, to see our upcoming events, coffee connections, career chats, etc. And until then, thank you for joining, and please be well. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.